As everyone joins, thank you for joining the first of our plant series, a series of free webinars by American Botanical Council and the Sustainable Herbs Program. And as everyone's joining, if you could take a moment and just introduce yourself in the chat. And as you introduce yourself, please make sure to click to all panelists and all attendees. Otherwise, only the panelists will see your introduction. And at the end of the webinar, we hope to have around 10 minutes for question and answers. So if you do have questions, please enter those in the Q&A rather than the chat, because then it makes it easier for the panelists to see what those questions are. So with that, I'll begin. As I said, we're thrilled to begin this series that's really focusing on particular plant species. And our goal with this series is really to celebrate the plants and their beauty and their place in cultural history and their role in biodiversity and all of that. And then also to really understand how these plants are being used by the botanical industry and the issues that all of us should be aware of. And finally, how, if you're a member of the industry or if you're someone who uses any of these plants, today saw Palmetto, really what issues you should be aware of and how you can support the plants and the cultural and ecological systems in which they flourish. And this webinar is part of this SHP Toolkit series. And the SHP Toolkit, if you can switch the slide. The SHP Toolkit is a collection of resources that's on best practices that are specifically for the botanical industry. You can download that for free on the Sustainable Herbs Program website. And this toolkit and the webinar series are all made possible through the generous support of our donors. And there's a slide here with our donors. And you can find out more about each of them by following the links on our website. And so today, I'm thrilled to have 4 esteemed panelists to talk about all aspects of saw Palmetto. ABC board member, among many other things, is Stephen Foster. We also have ABC's Chief Science Officer, Stefan Gafner, and Ed Fletcher, who's been working in the herb industry for many years and is currently president of Native Botanicals. And finally, Umasudhan Paul, who is the CEO of Valensa International. And rather than organizing this webinar as a series of question and answers, because each of the panelists has a particular area of expertise, I've asked them to speak first on that area, and then we'll open it for them to speak among themselves and then invite questions. So with that, I would love to begin with Stephen. If you could talk some about saw Palmetto. What is saw Palmetto? Where does it grow? Who harvests it?
Okay. Thank you, Anne, and it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I've been following and studying the saw Palmetto market since the early 1990s. It's a fascinating study into answering the question, where do herbs come from? And saw Palmetto itself is a foundational species in various woodland and wetland, at least the edge of wetland habitats in Florida, once covering as much as 10 million acres. And I've got a few slides that I'm going to share right now, just for those of you who don't know what the plant looks like in its habitat. This will give you an idea of what we're talking about here. So let me, okay, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Good, okay. Saw Palmetto. So here's a typical saw Palmetto pine scrub habitat in Florida. And so you can see that it produces impenetrable thickets. And it gets its name, honestly, from the saw-like teeth on the leaf petiole. you know, if you're harvesting saw palmetto berries, whatever clothes you have on are throwaway clothes, because these saw teeth on the petioles are going to tear your clothes up. Here's saw palmetto flowers. It produces a profusion of flowers, and not all of those flowers will produce saw palmetto fruits. So this image here gives you saw palmetto growth in its native habitat is stimulated by fire, and of course with humans entering saw palmetto's habitat, there's fire suppression. So you don't see this type of fire damage in saw palmetto like you might have 100 years ago. But that gives you a good idea of the structure of this woody plant. And actually, its greatest biomass is below ground. So these woody trunks are turn into underground rhizomes, and recently they found out that individual plants may be 700 years old, and a particular habitat may have genetic material that is 10,000 years old. So here's first of the fruit production, and you can see toward the center of the plant larger berries, and then at the end of the fruiting frond, smaller berries. So the berries basically mature and ripen at different periods of time. So you can see in this picture, you have black berries as well as orange berries and green berries, all on the same frond at the same time. When it comes to harvesting saw palmetto fruit, describing it as wild crafting is like describing coal mining as stone sculpting. It is a really hard job. I went out with a crew a few years ago. We traveled in the dark for 3 hours after meeting up at 3 o'clock in the morning. And these people are actually picking berries before sunrise here. And it took about a morning for a crew of 5 or 6 to fill up the back of a pickup truck. So this is very daunting, back-breaking work. Saw palmetto berries fruit in August and September in the heat and humidity of Florida. Eastern diamondbacks like to live underneath the plants, so you always have to be careful and mindful of what critters might be among the saw palmettos. And here's a couple of fronds, one of completely ripe berries and one with green, so-called green ripe, as well as completely ripe. And saw palmetto has a very peculiar flavor and fragrance that can be described as only as saw palmetto-like. So if you're around tonnage of fresh saw palmetto berries, that fragrance just permeates every pore of your body. So you can see this particular picker here, his clothes are drenched in sweat and covered with oils from the saw palmetto berries. And there's fresh saw palmetto berries coming into a drying facility, and saw palmetto berries in a dryer. Basically there's developing awareness over the difference between different levels of ripeness. So there's a opportunity for industry like the American Herbal Products Association to educate pickers on the right stage of ripeness for a better quality product. Here you see so-called green ripe, orange ripe, and fully black ripe saw palmetto berries. And this is the dried saw palmetto berry that enters the market and is made into extract. So that is a brief introduction to the plant.
That was fantastic. Thank you. There's lots more we could ask about that, but for now I wanted to move on to Ed. Fletcher, if you could paint a picture of the trade in general, who the stakeholders are and how that process works.
Okay. Thank you, Ann. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of the Sustainable Harvest Program. And Stephen, thank you so much for the pictures and painting the picture of the basics of what the saw palmetto looks like and how the harvest is. So I'm going to start, Ann, by just taking you through the day in the life of a picker. Stephen described some of what happens, but he got up a little earlier than we used to. He got up at 3. So a picker normally does get up early in the morning around 4 o'clock. They get all their buckets together, their long sleeve clothes on. Like Stephen said, they end up being disposable clothes because of the problems with harvesting on the saw palmettos. They get together with their crew, and usually there's a crew leader that has the permission slips and everything, which we'll talk about. So they load up in a vehicle and they drive to the harvest location. Just as Stephen said, it may be 3 or 4 hours away. And when they get there, they find out the land where they have permission to harvest, and then they spread out and go and perform the harvest, as Stephen said, as he showed in the photos, pulling the berries off or beating them on the bucket and then loading them into a bucket or putting them into bags. You know, they have to hike around and harvest. And as he said, this is not an easy job. The saws on the fronds of the saw palmetto are very difficult. They cut you a lot of times, cut your clothes. There's snakes, insects, other animals they have to deal with. And then they load up the berries and then they drive to the buying stations. And buying stations they're spread throughout Florida and oftentimes set up on the roadside, but the largest area in Florida is around Immokalee, where a majority of the buyers are set up on both sides of the road. So here the crew leaders or the berry pickers drive into town and they'll look around at how many buying stations. At one time, back in the 90s, there were up to 7 different buying stations on about a half a mile or a mile road. And literally they would drive around and see who was paying the most for the berries that day, because they wanted to get as much money as they could for their berries that day. And they may jump from one buyer to the next and just see who's going to pay them the most money. So then they would pull in, the buyer would weigh their berries, they would grade them and look at them and make sure they're what they're looking for. There are enough maturity berries in there to buy them, and then they would pay them cash. So that's another thing that's, like Stephen said, this saw palmetto business is completely unusual. The way he described the wildcrafting, it is wildcrafted out of the wild, but it is unusual. And I would say that this is one of the, I would believe, and I hope Stephen might agree, that this is the largest wild harvested crop in the US. It's definitely on the quantities. You just don't see this done in any large quantities like this. So anyway, the buyers will buy the berries and it's all a cash business. These pickers want cash for that day to go home and feed their family and pay the bills for the day, and they do it again the next day. So to get the quantity of berries that are harvested every year, it's a large undertaking by a lot of different people. And there's been a lot of different ways to approach it. We, as with Stephen, I've been working in this industry since the mid-90s. And in the mid to late 90s was when it was looked into as an agricultural crop. And one of the main companies at that time said, we have to have some control over this, even though it's a wild crop. So they fought, and saw palmetto was listed as an agricultural crop, I believe around 1995. And what that did was it gave it some legitimacy and also some capability of people protecting it, because in earlier years, a lot of berries were harvested off of land that was non-permittable or maybe without permission. And then again, in most recent years, in 2017, Florida, the state of Florida classified saw palmetto as a commercially exploited plant, and therefore it now requires permits. So you have to file for a permit that is valid for 1 year. You can apply for the permit at any time of year, but it runs out after 365 days. And the permit has to list who you are and where you're going to get the berries, and you have to have that permit to get on the land, as well as having permission from who you're harvesting from. So there's a lot of different things that have fallen into place that are legitimizing the saw palmetto berry harvest, because it normally comes off of private land. Majority of it is private land. There's ranchers, a lot of ranch land in Florida where it's harvested from, and then some of it's on public land. But you have to have permission on any land in Florida. Even if you're harvesting off your own land, you need to have this permit, and it's a record keeping. We talked a little bit about the quantity that's been harvested of saw palmetto through the years, and I believe Uma may speak to that more. But based on the tonnage survey that's done from the American Herbal Products Association, these are numbers from 1999 to 2010. It ranges, but the average from those 10 years, the average of dry berries is 2.9 million berries. So if you're looking at fresh berries, it's a 3-to-1 or a 3.2 extraction or fresh to dry ratio. So it's a lot higher for fresh berries. In other words, it takes a lot of fresh berries to put the material on the market. And I wanted to say that a majority of the berries, as Stephen showed and mentioned, go for extraction. And that's when they're mature. And that's one thing that we're also trying to get the buyers and the companies, and the buyers really have the most influence. We want to wait until the berries are ripe, because we did a study back in the 90s also that if you go and pick the early berries that are not ripe yet, that are not ripe enough even, and you sell those, because lots of times the pickers just need the money. They're migrant labor between crops and they need the money then. But if they go in and pick those berries off, if they would leave the same amount of berries on the same bush, they would go back and harvest 3 times as much weight. So we try to convince them to wait. And another thing is we've gotten together as an industry, and generally speaking, as Stephen said, they start ripening to a mature state, normally around August, middle of August in late southern Florida, and then the harvest migrates north as the season goes on. But if they would wait till the mature berries, that's the ones that are most desired. But there is a market for powder berries, which will take a little bit of the unripe berries, but I've talked to some people in the industry, and generally speaking, it's understood that only about 10% of the total harvest goes to powder berries, and about 90% currently is going to extract berries, which is the more mature berries. So I hope that gives you a better idea of who the harvest is and who's doing that in.
Great, thank you, Ed. I wanted to ask you if you could talk a little bit more. So when they're sold on the street in Amoki, if I pronounced it correctly, and then who are the different kind of buyers? They're different, where they go from there, the different routes.
Well, once the buyers, some of the buyers are set up and funded by the companies who make the finished product now. In the past, it used to be they were strictly independent, and they turned and sold their products to the person that would value their berries the best. And each company has a different criteria and specifications for the berries, but it depends on their fatty acid content, the oil they're looking for in the berries, and different criteria. But majority of the buyers now are funded or backed or supported by companies who are making the finished product. And it's a collaboration, which I think works better, because then the customer, the end user, the end processor knows what they want out of their berries, and they can dictate that down to the buyer and also the pickers. So in that way, there's much less loss in berries, and also the quality, there's less rejection. So I think that collaboration has also opened up transparency much more, which is a good thing.
Great, thank you.
You're welcome.
Stefan, do you want to now speak some about, Ed and Stephen have talked about the different types of berries, but the extraction processes and how adulteration can play into that, and those issues to be aware of.
So thank you, Anne, and also thanks a lot for having me. I unfortunately, or maybe fortunately, have never had to go pick saw palmetto berries in the hot sun in Florida. That's maybe why I still have a shirt that is presentable. But anyway, I thought a little bit on how to connect the quality aspects of saw palmetto to sustainability. And I've talked to a few people in the industry. The berry is native from Florida to South Carolina, and usually the harvest volume is in the 4,000 to 8,000 metric ton range, although that can almost double depending on the year. But overall, it seems like the there are enough berries grown and harvested in a normal year, in an average year, that can supply the market. So I think from the point of view of sustainability, it seems like there's enough saw palmetto growing that would sustain the dietary supplement market. There are some years where that's not the case because saw palmetto is susceptible in particular to environmental changes. So a case in point, in 2018, there was extensive rain that interrupted the flowering period and led to a substantial drop in berries. So the amount of berries to be harvested was much lower than average. And that on one hand leads to pickers have to go much farther away to gather the berries. So their amount that they collect is lower. And then on the other hand, the price goes up. And in early September 2018, back to the example, the price of saw palmetto was 3 times higher than the average price the year before. So in situations like that, when the price is high and the supply is low, that sometimes unfortunately entices fraudsters to sell products labeled as saw palmetto that are made from other ingredients. And I've listed some reasons why saw palmetto extract in particular is vulnerable to adulteration. So one of these reasons is that it's relatively easy to make or to mimic the chemical composition of saw palmetto extracts. Most people mainly quantify fatty acids. Fatty acids are ingredients or chemicals that you find in all vegetable oils. So if you use a sunflower oil, a coconut oil, or a canola oil, you have these oils that are rich in fatty acids. And if you mix them and match them at the right ratios, you get something that looks like a fatty acid profile of saw palmetto. The fraudsters also have become fairly sophisticated. So if you just look at these chemical constituents, you may actually be fooled, and you may think it's saw palmetto while it's something else. So it's sometimes they get by the quality control testing. And the adulterating materials are cheap. So if you compare sunflower oil or canola oil to a saw palmetto extract, it obviously shows you that you can make a lot of money out of it. And if you do sell your fraudulent material at a lower price, you can get a competitive disadvantage, which for the good companies is a big headache, because it's difficult to compete with other suppliers or other materials on the market that are half of the price of what you can offer. Then one other reason that I see as why saw palmetto is vulnerable is that the risk of getting caught are relatively low. The adulterants, as I said, sunflower oil, coconut oil, don't represent a health risk. So for authorities to go after saw palmetto adulteration, there's not really a big incentive to do that. They have what I would say bigger fish to fry. So I haven't really seen much enforcement towards policing the saw palmetto industry. There was one case last year where a manufacturer actually sued their supplier. They bought about $500,000 worth of adulterated material that was allegedly saw palmetto. And that was debated in the court of New Jersey. I'm not quite sure what the outcome was, but I believe that the supplier actually wasn't accused or didn't have to pay any fines. It may be still ongoing, but that's one way, that avenue that the manufacturer can go if they are unknowingly buying adulterated material. Maybe the last comment I want to make is that adulteration comes in all shapes and forms. I believe the adulteration of the extract is probably the biggest concern. I've also, as Ed Fletcher said, there may be some people that sell unripe berries as ripe berries, or that can be accidental, that actually there are some unripe berries that get into the market for ripe berries. So I think that happens. And more rarely, there are also berries from other palm species that can get into the harvest or be sold as saw palmetto berries. And then what I've heard also happening is that some companies may extract or make a saw palmetto extract from the berries and then sell that as genuine saw palmetto, dry the berries, grind them up, and sell the pre-extracted or the leftovers to the dietary supplement industry as powdered berries. So that's another way that seems to happen. The one thing that I think that, and Ed pointed to that, saw palmetto has actually fairly characteristic color and odor. I've never smelled it. I think Roy Upton said it's something like dirty socks. Maybe Ed can say something more about it, or Stephen. But I think if you look at the extract and you smell it, you get an idea if it's somewhat authentic or if it's just really a replacement with vegetable oil. So that seems to be a really important aspect. Just get an idea of what authentic oil smells and looks like, and I think you're already on a good way to a pretty decent quality product.
Thank you, Stefan. Just the last question. So is that also as an end user in the supplement aisle, is that the way to discern adulterated or non-adulterated, or what you're talking more about in the dietary supplement supply?
I was talking more for the manufacturer. I've used saw palmetto myself. It smells a little bit, but the manufacturers, the formulators, have a tendency to add all sorts of other oils and excipients. So it's not as pronounced as I would think it is when you go in the field or if you're in a manufacturing facility. So what
would an end user, a consumer, look for to make sure it's not an adulterated product?
My recommendation is usually to go with a brand that has been clinically tested, and there are a number of those that are around, and that you can look on databases which ones have been clinically tested. So that's my criteria. If there's a company that has a clinically tested product, I don't think they would spend the money to pay for a clinical trial and then buy adulterated materials.
25 years ago, there were when herbs first hit the mass market after Gachet was passed and were in large box retailers. One retailer had a product that was $2.20 for a 30-day supply. And then right next to it, they had a clinically tested product that was nearly $25. So you get what you pay for with saw palmetto.
Thank you all. Thanks. So now I'd love to turn Uma to you and to hear if you could speak to this year's harvest and the challenges that you all faced and what's.
Absolutely. Thank you very much for the opportunity. Let me start by just quickly giving introduction to the panel here and all the participants about Valensa. So Valensa is based in Florida. So we are kind of, the saw palmetto has been the DNA of the company. It was, the company was found for extracting saw palmetto here in Florida. The founder of the company saw that there's a lot of these berries that are being harvested from his land. He got curious what was happening. They said this all shipping to Europe for extraction, and it was sold as a herbal medicine in Europe. So that's how the journey started about 22 years back. I think, I think even the founder of ABC was there for the foundation of Valensa. So the idea was to harvest these precious berries and extract it right here in Florida. So it's been the DNA of the company. It's been, and we have gone through the journey. And I've been with the company for about 12 years, but all my life, I'm an agriculture engineer. I spent pretty much in nutraceuticals and botanicals myself, and it's a very interesting crop. So I would definitely I should thank my supply chain team for helping me prepare. We have a very over the past 5 years, we really put that in place to bring in strong supply chain capabilities. We call this as kind of domesticating the beast a little bit. It's wild harvested. So how do we make sure that we kind of bring in a lot of systems and procedures in the process, make it more safe and responsible for all the stakeholders. So let me thank the team for that. And most importantly, we should I think Stefan and Stephen were talking about the clinically trial. So saw palmetto extract, what we call as a lipidosterolic extract of saw palmetto, because it's got the fatty acid lipid profile and sterols too. There are over 50 plus clinical trials. It's very unique for that kind of botanicals. It's almost like a pharmaceutical kind of evidence of science built on it. And it's been sold as an herbal medicine in Europe by in countries like France, Germany. So at the right dose, at the right profile, established by U.S. Pharmacopoeia, has got a profile for saw palmetto extract. In fact, we have gone through the journey of getting our product USP verified, and we are talking about authenticity. How does a customer know that he's buying the right product? So U.S. Pharmacopoeia has got a profile. It's not just total fatty acid. It's the ratios, the smell, like Stefan said. I sit in a factory, I smell them every day. So it's not that bad, but it's definitely pungent. So, maybe we got used to it, but our process is very, very unique because we use deep supercritical CO2. We don't use any solvents extracting it. So that's the kind of the overlay of what how we have been doing so far. What we did about 4 years back was to put in a supply chain program. We actually called it as GEMS. It's not an acronym. It's like GEMS is like, I think when we had the discussion, somebody said that saw palmetto was viewed as a pest. The landowners didn't like it. They wanted out of the. So we kind of changed the view of it's not a pest, it's actually a gem. It's actually something more precious if we can do certain things to manage it. So we kind of, our pillars of GEMS, we call it purity. Purity is all about how do we address adulteration, efficacy. That's a USP and all that. But the other 3 pillars of GEMS is what we call as traceability, sustainability, and responsibility. And that all is part of the supply chain. And so that is a very key driver. And the whole webinar is about sustainability of this rare botanical. And I will tell you, it's not only us, our customers are looking at that as a very key value driver for the entire supply chain. So when we got into this journey, we looked at it at 3 parts. We look at what we call as crop mapping and monitoring. That's the first part. And the second part is what we do is how do we do crop management? And the third part is really crop security, which is about safety, responsible harvest. So we kind of put this into 3 different ways of how we go with the saw palmetto. So just to give you a quick overview of what happened in 2020. So 2020 was overall an average crop, and but if you look at the last, I think Ed had a lot of data since 1999. So we have done that. And pretty much what we have done is more in a more scientific way. We have started monitoring for the past, 5 to 7 years, and we've actually created a crop monitoring index. Just like how you have for, soybean or corn. So we kind of started working on a model to create a crop index and start monitoring the volumes and what actually contributes to these volumes. Like what are the factors that impact weather, pollination, crop diseases, soil conditions. So we're taking a very scientific approach to that. It's not completely foolproof yet because we're still learning. And we're working with the University of Florida. We're working with people who are 5th generation farmers who have the native knowledge of how the crop works, and bringing all these into the, we talked about partnership. That's very critical for this. So based on the crop index, we would say that this year was almost like a 60% of a normal crop. Last year was like a 125% plus. So last year was a bumper crop. 2019 was a bumper crop. And 2020 is an average crop of about 60% of the crop index. But I should also say that when we started, we do the crop mapping and monitoring. When you're looking at that in February, March, the outlook really looked good. It was looking like another normal, maybe even a bumper crop. But then things change from March, April, May, June, and then so a lot of things change, and that's where the crop management part becomes very critical. And crop management, we do the pre-harvest and post-harvest technology as well. So the first challenge is really the crop itself because of this, and how do we manage that? I'll get to how do we face those challenges. The second challenge with Saw Palmetto is really the supply chain related, harvest management. So timing of the harvest, quality of the harvest, and the labor, related to that. So I think the questions that we had, and we were challenged by our customers, 3 years, 4 years back, when the price started escalating, is like, how do we ensure that we actually responsibly harvest these quality berries? How do we make sure that the right price is, the stakeholders are being compensated in this model, the landowners, the pickers, the harvesting companies, the drying companies. Eventually, sustainability is not only about, it's about, all the key stakeholders. It's just not about one piece, all the key stakeholders and preserving Mother Nature has to go hand in hand. So we have to make sure that our customers were getting a sustainable supply, pricing, that our customers will be able to manage their brands better. So just to quickly go through the challenges and how we address that this year. Breaking into those 3 parts, the crop mapping and monitoring. This is the first part. As I said, it's a learning curve. We've worked very closely with the University of Florida and quite a few consultants who, apart from the ag business, who've done this for other crops, and see how we can bring those systems and learnings into a wild harvested crop like Saw Palmetto. So based on that, we knew it was getting toward a below average crop. But what helped us with the crop monitoring system, which we did data plot sets to show that, there were some pockets of South Florida which is good, and there were coastal areas, as Stephen was saying, that some parts of coastal had a good crop, and Panhandle was good. So we could actually time our harvest and ensure that we focus our partners and pickers at that place, so that we can go after where the crop is. The second part, which is the crop management and working with stakeholders. So that's about landowners and harvesting companies. So that is still a work in progress. So the crop management we're talking about is really pollination. Like, how can we make sure that, there's better pollination happening? How do we make sure that we address some of the crop diseases, which can be, even if it's wild, it could still be managed, and ensure that those issues that impact the berry droppings can be addressed. So we've taken some pilot steps towards that. And we've done some even cultivation of Saw Palmetto, which is still in very pilot stages. But I think early intervention is very critical for Saw Palmetto. And since we are working mostly with private land, the crop management piece becomes very critical. And that's one of the ways we address those challenges. The third part, which is crop security and safety and responsibility, that's very critical because, as Ed was saying, there's been a lot of, bad practices in the industry because of how this has evolved as a wild crop. And there was a lot of freelancing, and there was a lot of breaking into properties. That's one of the reasons why, a lot of the landowners felt it was a pest, because I was getting, robbed, or people were, getting into a property and taking the berries away. We don't know why. So that had to change. And the only way we could change is the permits came in place in 2017. There was a big breakthrough. In fact, Valensa and our drying company, we are part of Fresh from Florida. So we work with the what we call as FDAC, the Florida Department of Agriculture and Consumer Services, to bring in permits, have Fresh from Florida. So you know that this is part of a Florida crop. So those were very critical. And also you cannot break
One
an
more
old,
minute, okay. One more minute.
yeah, we cannot break an old practice by ourselves. So what we did for first time this year is we actually exclusively partnered with the multi-generation harvesting company. So like we talked about Immokalee, we kind of moved away from that market and said, let's work with harvesting companies and local partnerships, and which is kind of win-win situations. We can pay the fair price to the land, to the pickers. The picker safety becomes very critical, so they don't get in the harm's way. So those things were very critical in terms of facing the challenges on the supply end of things. Thank you.
Yeah, no, I'm sure there's so much more to talk about on all of this. I had one quick question for you. How did COVID impact the migrant communities that were doing the harvesting?
That's a good question. So the multi-generation harvesting company that we built, that we worked with this year, they were between the watermelon crop and the pumpkin. So watermelon just got over, and they had their H1A workers already in Florida, who were they had the protocols from CDC, how they have to live and how they'll be tested, masks, and so if somebody gets sick, they need to be quarantined for 14 days. So all those guidelines were put in place, so that didn't impact the harvest.
Great, thank you all. There's so many different threads that I could ask. I wanted to tease one out though, which is around the sustainability and the practices. And it's a wild harvested berry. Uma, as you were saying, there's lots of ways to manage that. But Ed, I wondered if you could talk a bit about, from an industry perspective, are there ways to sort of work with the harvesters to make sure the practices are done responsibly?
Yes, I mean.
And wait, I want to add one thing. If you could add a little bit, so this is a different harvesting community than, say, Appalachian wild harvesting, where the craft is passed down in different ways. If you could talk about that a little bit.
Yes, like Uma said, it's a multi-generational. Sometimes it's the father, grandfather, the father, and the sons and the families, but they're migrant workers, and it changes from year to year. So education-wise, it's difficult to share that. But yeah, it is quite different than any other wildcrafted crop. It's in a field of its own, and that's why it's all in Florida. And the more that you can work with crews to do, the better. So the sustainability part. First, I wanted to answer Stefan's question, do they stink or do they smell? Well, if you're not in the industry, they stink. If you're in the industry, they smell like money, okay? So anyway.
Well, we got some comments in the thread, like Stephen Dentali said they smell like aged Parmesan, and Eric Yarnell like vomit. So I think obviously they're not in the industry.
That's right. If you're in the industry, you smell like money. But as far as sustainability, Ann, yeah, I applaud Valensa for what they're doing, but there's been a lot of different private issues or tasks on sustainability. For example, in the late 90s, we funded a study when I was at Wilcox Natural Products. We funded a study through the University of Florida to make sure that we were not damaging the crop or taking too much for the wildlife. And it's proprietary private knowledge, but we did prove that the amount of berries that were harvested for the saw palmettos off of each shrub leaves plenty of berries for the bears. It's one of their big crops, and some of the other wildlife. So, and actually that was done basically by looking at the pollinators, looking at the season, and that was done over average of, I believe, about 5 years. But there's been a lot of sustainability, and the fact that we're only harvesting the berries, we're not damaging the roots, we're not digging up the roots and stuffing the plant. That's another reason for sustainability. The other thing is, I think one of the biggest challenges that sustainability is just human expansion in Florida. And also, if you'll look on any website that's like a rancher's website or a landowner's website in Florida, and you type in saw palmetto, the main thread on that website is how to get rid of saw palmetto, how to dose them up, when to burn them, and when to get rid of them. But also, I was going to mention that the American Herbal Products Association, in conjunction with many other organizations, is developing good stewardship harvesting brochures. I think you probably can't see it, but we're getting ready to release one on saw palmetto berries very soon. I'd like to offer that to all the participants, and we'll forward that to you as soon as we finalize it. And it talks about the time of year to harvest, how to get permits, where to go to get the permits and everything. And it addresses a lot of bit about the sustainability.
Great, thank you. And there's a lot of questions in the Q&A, so I'm going to turn to those because there's one especially that follows on, Ed, what you were talking about, and whomever of the panelists can answer this, that would be great. This question is, can someone further discuss how traditional ecological knowledge is incorporated into the monitoring practices and policy involved with saw palmetto?
Well, I mean, as far as policy, the fact that it's a wild crop and it's listed as an agricultural crop, and it's very dependent. So I think that opened the door for a lot of others. But Uma, possibly you can address that.
Yeah, I think the local partnership is very important. So we like working with the University of Florida, and there are research centers very focused on saw palmetto and funding that, and working with the professors who've been working on it for decades. The second is you work with the ag harvesting companies here, and they have, even though they haven't, so the company that we worked with this year, it was the first year they were doing saw palmetto, but they have 5th generation working in other ag products. They went into watermelon, so they had a lot of expertise. So when they bring that expertise into this crop, there is a learning curve for both sides, and that actually worked in the favor of the saw palmetto industry, because now we are trying to say, how can we do things better? How can we bring in the learnings from other crops into saw palmetto so it becomes a win-win situation? So the landowners don't look at that as a pest anymore. They don't want to get rid of that. They feel, oh, there is money to be made, but now we need somebody to come and help us to manage and tell us how the right way to harvest it. How do we manage the crop? How do we make sure there's no diseases in it? How do we make sure it's harvested at the right time? And then they get paid for it. So that's the whole process of bringing the traditional knowledge into saw palmetto and managing it.
Yeah, Stephen, thank you.
Well, if you look at it from a traditional perspective, from an indigenous perspective in Florida, you're talking about basically a European alien invasion, which brings cattle to Florida as after first contact in 1513. And the Glade Indians, the native groups of southern Florida, the Calusa, Tequesta, Miami, Job, and other groups are extinct. Okay, these are extinct human populations. And the Seminoles were are a conglomerate of migrating Creek, Muskogees, a mixed group that in terms of traditional land management tried to stay away from white America at one point in history. And there were the famous Seminole Wars, the last one in 1838, when General Andrew Jackson took 3,000 troops to Florida and wiped out as many native populations as possible. So in terms of a traditional knowledge base, we know little about it from an ecological perspective. Just part of the history, and which also relates, there was a famous captivity tract, a book on a shipwreck of Quakers in Florida in 1699. And that's where you get the first famous quote from the author Jonathan Dickinson on the flavor of saw palmetto from the shipwrecked Quakers. And to quote, "They gave us some of their berries to eat. We tasted them, but not one amongst us could suffer them to stay in our mouths, for we could compare the taste to them of nothing else but rotten cheese steeped in tobacco." End of quote. So there you go.
So it's just a follow on that. It's a wild harvested plant, but it's a very different cultural tradition that surrounds it, say, than black cohosh or ginseng and golden seal coming from Appalachia.
way different.
Yeah.
And Ed, there's one other wild harvested plant in North America, harvested in 13 states, that far exceeds saw palmetto berries. And that's black walnuts at about 30 million pounds.
Thank you.
If anyone else wanted to respond to that, I'll move to another question that shifts to adulteration. And Stefan, this is directed at you. What are some additional testing analyses a company can use to protect themselves from using an adulterated saw palmetto material?
Well, thanks for the question. I have written an answer to someone else who had the similar question. I would say go beyond the fatty acids, because that's what most fraudsters try to match saw palmetto. So if you look at other components or constituents of saw palmetto, that could be the sterols, and I'm sorry to throw some chemical names out there, but the fatty alcohols or the pigments, I think you'll have a much better chance of detecting adulteration. And I want to also point out that we've actually published a saw palmetto lab guidance document as part of the Botanical Adulterants Prevention Program, where we looked at existing methods and their suitability to detect saw palmetto adulteration. And lastly, we're also having started an initiative to look at additional constituents, because I think some of the constituents that haven't been looked at yet are the most interesting. And I also think that some of the efficacies that we see in humans could be related to those ingredients that we haven't discovered yet. So I think that will be quite an exciting adventure there.
That relates to another question in a way. If someone was asking, you could explain the different kinds of processes used to extract saw palmetto, because that relates to this idea of knowing what you're extracting, right? And if there are other possible constituents, how to get the most from the extraction process. I'm not sure who of you wants to respond to that.
Just to add to Stefan and this question. So as you rightly said, there are different extraction processes. The most widely used in the US is supercritical CO2. So that's a pretty established extraction process. The second is you can, in Europe, they use ethanol. You can use ethanol, or you can use hexane. And hexane is also approved as for the herbal medicine that's sold in France as well. So there are three predominant different extraction processes. To most part, all the three actually does yield the same amount of fatty acid profile and the unique phytopigments and phytonutrients in saw palmetto. As you rightly said, a lot of companies are looking at the spec and say 85 to 90% total fatty acid. And a lot of companies cheat based on that, because if you look at the US pharmacopoeia, there are almost like 15 different things that the fingerprint of saw palmetto, there's a fingerprint, just like how we have fingerprints, there's a fingerprint for saw palmetto. So unless the fingerprint passes, there is a scope for adulteration. So it's fatty acids, the ratio of fatty acids. It's not one fatty acid, the ratio of the fatty acids. There are 9 different fatty acid ratios. Total, long chain fatty alcohols, carotenoids, and the sterols, and there is a fingerprint. There's a range too. It's a tight range. If it's above, then somebody's adding something to spike it, or if there's less, then there's another oil added to this. So it's a very tightly done, very very well defined. It has centuries of know-how that has gone into the monograph. So it's easy to find if somebody's cheating if they can test it. Irrespective of what extraction process you use, ethanol, hexane, or supercritical CO2.
There's so many, there are more questions, and we're coming to the end of the hour, and I want to respect everyone's time. I wondered if, in closing, if any of, or all of you have just one or two things to say about what those of us on the end who using the products can do to support the plant and the health of the communities whose livelihoods are part of that plant. Almost, you want to start?
Absolutely. I think Reeves, the first point is it's a gem. So botanicals are extremely important. It is important for us to treat them in a very respectful way. They are very beneficial for human health. They are safe alternatives to a lot of medications, and in the same field of what we call as BPH or LUTs. The medications come with a lot of side effects. Palmetto's got no side effects. One of the safest herbal botanicals out there. It's been well documented and well studied. I think it's upon us as industry to do the right thing to make sure that the crop is managed in a sustainable way. Make sure that we don't fall or encourage adulteration, cheating, and do the right thing for sustaining the crop, the berry, and also sustaining human health.
Great, thank you. Stephen?
60 years ago, there were 5 million people in Florida. Now there's 21.5 million people with 135 million visitors each year. So, part of the problem is habitat loss for human activity. But at the same time, Florida, given its size and diversity and conservatism, one might say, has done a pretty good job at creating conservation wild areas through various state agencies, Nature Conservancy, numerous city parks and state parks. And I think all of those entities are becoming aware of saw palmetto simply because it's in the news, it's on the internet. When in the early 90s, nobody paid attention to saw palmetto because the price was 8 to 10 cents a pound.
Right.
And then in 1995, European usage had increased by tenfold, and then it went to the mass market in the US, and the price went up to an unheard of price of $3 a pound for the fresh berries. So that's when people started paying attention to saw palmetto, and basically all the information we have starts at that period to the present day. So we're still learning.
Great, thank you. Stefan, do you want to?
Well, to be short, for saw palmetto, be willing to pay for the quality, and as a general idea, take care of the environment. Be sure that we don't damage the climate more than we've already done.
I agree, thanks. Ed, you get the last word.
Oh, thank you. So yeah, back in the 90s, like you said, it was cheap. And at that time, I didn't pay much attention, not only because it was cheap, but I was too young to use it. Now that I'm at the age to use it and it works, I'd say value it. But the one thing I tell consumers is when you're going to buy a product for your health, don't go to buy the cheapest, in my opinion. You get what you pay for. And especially in saw palmetto, the companies that do it right, that have the history, that put the money into sustainable harvest and do the test and everything to make sure it is a good product on the shelf, they're not going to be the cheapest, but in my opinion, they're the best product to use. So support those companies, by the ones that have the long history. I know that Fair Wild is a possibility for some companies in the future, and even if they have organic products, because in the mandate of the organic, you have to be sustainable in your harvest. So just support the companies that are doing it right. And like Stefan said, be prepared to pay for it, but it's a good product and it works. Thank you.
Thank you all so much for your time, and thank everyone for joining. It's great to see such interest in this issue and topic. And we'll have the recording available on the Sustainable Herbs Program website. And we also have more information there about upcoming webinars. Next Thursday, I'll be speaking with Dr. Claudia Ford, who's an ethnobotanist, and she's talking about fascinating historical research on the use of cotton and black haul on plantations in the American South and the implications for thinking about how plants travel and the political and economic context of that. And then on November 12th, we'll be speaking with Mark Plotkin about his years of work in the Amazon and beyond. And then at the end of October, this is the next slide, I'll be speaking with Sebastian Pohl from Pucka Herbs on, this is in the Sustainable Herbs Program Toolkit series. And this is around how to really create a culture of sustainability and regeneration within a company, so that it's not just coming from the top, but it's embedded in the practices and culture of interaction and day-to-day decision-making. So all that information is on the website, as well as recordings of the previous webinars that we've been hosting. And thank you all so much for your participation.
Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Anne.
Thanks.
Thank you.